He believed his robe would shield him forever. But when Judge Boasberg began protecting political insiders, Pam Bondi upended the system. Standing at the podium in Tallahassee, her hair pulled tight, her voice steady but resolute, Bondi wasn't. Reading from a script. No teleprompter. No notes. Just a stack of sealed documents. Her eyes locked onto the cameras, onto every journalist in the room. "This isn't political. This is about trust," she declared, and Judge Boasberg has broken it. The words detonated like a bomb. They echoed across television screens in living rooms, courtrooms, and conference halls. A sitting federal judge facing criminal charges, it felt like fiction, not the morning news. But Bondi didn't flinch. 48 hours earlier, whispers had surfaced within the Department of Justice, a sealed file, an internal audit, a case review tied to Judge James Boasberg, a longtime fixture in the judiciary, known more for his connections than his rulings. Few Americans had even heard his name. Until now. Bondi had been watching for months. The breaking point? A late Friday decision in a D.C. courtroom. Boasberg had issued a restraining order, blocking the deportation of 5 individuals with suspected ties to Trendiragua, a gang so ruthless even seasoned ICE agents hesitated. The ruling wasn't just controversial, it was suspicious. No written order, just a vague verbal directive. Homeland Security assumed the lack of a signed order gave them clearance to proceed. They moved forward. Hours later, reporters swarmed ICE offices. Protesters lined federal buildings. Behind the scenes, something else cracked. Bondi was already in contact with DHS leadership and the White House counsel that night. "He's protecting criminals," she allegedly said in a closed-door call. "He's not interpreting the law, he's hiding behind it." That call triggered action, not just political maneuvering, but something deeper. What the public didn't yet know, Bondi's team had been quietly building a case, interviews with former clerks, internal memos from a whistleblower in the D.C. circuit, even encrypted messages between Boasberg and his former aides, flagged in a side-channel investigation. She wasn't just angry, she was preparing for war. At the press conference, she didn't lay out every charge, but she made it clear. Obstruction of justice was on the table, misconduct in office, a pattern of rulings that veered from legal norms in critical national security cases. Viewers didn't know what shocked them more, what she said or the fact that someone was finally saying it. Cable news scrambled to process. Legal analysts speculated on the ramifications. Junior attorneys in chat groups whispered the same. Question: is this really happening? Pam Bondi had always been tough. But this was something else. She wasn't just challenging a judge, she was dismantling his legacy, case by case, line by line. In the days that followed, her words were dissected on every network. Critics called it political retaliation. Supporters called it bravery. The nation was divided, but one thing was clear. This wasn't a stunt. Bondi had pulled the pin. The explosion was just beginning. But why now? Why Boasberg? Long before the headlines, before the accusations, James E. Boasberg was untouchable. A Georgetown graduate, Yale Law alum, a fixture in D.C. circles with ties from K Street to Capitol Hill. He wasn't feared. He was protected. He played the game well. His rise was textbook D.C. Superior Court, then elevated by President Obama to the U.S. District Court. By 2020, he was Chief Judge of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, overseeing some of the nation's most sensitive security cases. Over time, his rulings drew scrutiny, not for one decision but for a pattern. In Honolulu, when the FBI faced backlash for surveillance abuses, it was Boasberg who reviewed the fallout. His judgments were measured, calculated, and now, for the first time, under fire. Some called his rulings careful. Others saw them as weak. A slap on the wrist here, a warning there. No consequences, no deterrence. Critics began to murmur. Judge Boasberg had grown too comfortable protecting institutions instead of holding them accountable. Pam Bondi was one of those critics. For months, she had watched in silence as his name surfaced in case after case, cases with implications far beyond the courtroom. Immigration enforcement, executive power, national security. To Bondi, he wasn't just making controversial rulings. He was shaping the battlefield from the bench. Then came the restraining order on the deportations. That ruling was different. It, too, wasn't just legally murky. It felt deliberate. And Bondi wasn't the only one who thought so. DHS officials were blindsided. "We got no paperwork," read one internal email. "Are we really grounding flights over a hallway comment from a judge?" The answer eventually was no. The deportations went forward. And that's when Boasberg threatened contempt proceedings. He accused the administration of defying court orders, but legal analysts pointed out a glaring issue. There was no enforceable written ruling. Behind closed doors, Bondi's team was furious. This wasn't oversight. This was obstruction. She authorized a deep dive into Boasberg's court history, not just his rulings, but his case management notes. Clerk memos, scheduling inconsistencies, personal communications, and the deeper they dug, the more they found. A pattern of undisclosed correspondences, a suspicious number of redacted case notes, especially in cases involving encrypted technologies. Specifically, Signal wasn't just a tech story. It had become a legal minefield. In early 2024, a lawsuit had emerged, quietly at first, then louder, accusing senior Trump administration officials of using Signal to coordinate sensitive operations without a paper trail. When that case landed, on Boasberg's docket, red flags went up, not because he was biased yet, but because he had personal connections to several people named in the discovery process. Still, he didn't recuse himself. He kept the case. Then, he pushed hearings behind. Closed doors, sealed witness lists, restricted press access. Bondi wasn't just suspicious. She was convinced Boasberg had protected key players, either by shielding evidence or delaying proceedings until the trail went cold. The DOJ began pulling call logs, subpoenaing emails, examining timelines that didn't add up, and a pattern emerged: delays in hearings, missing filings, unexplained changes to access logs. Bondi's theory? Boasberg was running interference, protecting people who never wanted those messages to see the light of day. By the time the deportation order landed, she had already made up her mind. It was no longer a question of if she would go public. It was only a matter of when. But something else happened. Something personal. Inside DOJ headquarters, just off Constitution Avenue, Bondi sat in a cramped, dimly lit room with senior advisors. The air smelled like burnt coffee and printer toner. A white noise machine hummed outside to keep conversations private, but nothing could mask the tension in the room. "We can't ignore this," she said, locking eyes with Deputy Counsel Arland. Stokes. "Not anymore." On the table between them sat a folder, slim but weighty, the kind that didn't need to be thick to be dangerous, just the right 3 or 4 documents, perfectly timed. Inside were Signal chat excerpts, recovered through a quiet third-party subpoena. Someone on the periphery of the case had cooperated. They didn't leak it to the press. They sent it straight to Bondi's office. And there it was. A message sent from a federal staffer to Boasberg, 2 months before he took the Signal case. The language was vague but damning. "They're planning to dump some of it in late March, but don't worry, Jay. I've got it covered on our end." Bondi read it twice, maybe 3 times. Her hands were shaking. Stokes tried to downplay it. Could be nothing. Could be misinterpreted. She wasn't buying it. "It's not just this message," she said. "It's everything behind it. The patterns, the redactions, the verbal rulings with no paper trail, the hearings pushed out of public view. It's too clean." Then she said the words that changed everything. "I'm not letting this get buried in an Inspector General report 3 years from now." That was the moment everything shifted. The next 72 hours were a whirlwind: legal prep, PR strategy, internal briefings with the Office of Legal Counsel. They didn't want a leak. They wanted impact. But here's what the public didn't see. 2 days before the press conference, Pam Bondi made a call, not to an advisor, not to a strategist, to a judge. An older federal judge in Phoenix, someone she trusted, someone who had been watching the Boasberg situation from afar. No politics, no headlines, just years on the bench and an unshakable understanding of how power works. "You sure about this, Pam?" the judge asked. "I am. You'll burn a lot of bridges." "I'm not here to make friends," she replied. "I'm here to clean house." She didn't say it with anger. She said it with clarity. She knew the cost, politically, personally, but she also knew the cost of walking away. Because by now, this wasn't just about legal integrity. Earlier that year, a mother in Corpus Christi had written to Bondi. Her son, a border agent, had been seriously injured in a botched operation involving 2 men with suspected ties to Tren de Aragua. They had slipped through processing because of a court-ordered hold signed by Judge James Boasberg. The mother's words stayed with her. "We can't keep pretending politics don't have real-world consequences. My son's spine is broken. He can't walk, and the man responsible is being shielded by a judge who won't show his face." Pam never forgot that letter. She kept it in her desk. So when people later accused her of making this personal, they weren't entirely wrong. It was personal. Not out of spite, out of duty. Once she went public, once she named Boasberg and confirmed an open investigation, there was no turning back. Her reputation, her position, her credibility, now tied to the outcome of this case. And as the story spread, another thread began to unravel. Because Signalgate wasn't just about texts, it was about who was hiding behind them. The internet caught on fast. Within days, Signalgate was everywhere. TV panels, podcasts, Reddit threads. It wasn't just about a messaging app anymore. It was about who was using it, what they were hiding, why Boasberg had tried to smother it in procedural dust. Signal wasn't new to Washington, but its rise during the Trump administration had alarmed certain corners of the intelligence community. Staffers, legal aides, senior officials, they all started using it, claiming it was to reduce leaks. But Signal automatically deletes messages, and in government that's a problem, because in government, records matter. That was the heart of the original lawsuit, filed by a small watchdog group in San Diego. Most people dismissed it at first. Then the documents surfaced, scheduling conflicts, deleted calendar entries, massive gaps in documentation. People started asking questions. Then came the names, not just low-level assistants, real names, a former national security advisor, an undersecretary of defense, even someone who had once worked directly under Boasberg as a legal consultant during a surveillance review. Yet Boasberg stayed on the case. He didn't recuse himself, didn't acknowledge the connections in court. Instead, he scheduled a closed-door pretrial hearing and issued a vague statement about ongoing procedural reviews. That's when Bondi's team lost all patience. They deciphered the encrypted logs from Signal's servers. Not easy. Not something done lightly, but a legal window tied to national security let the DOJ push it through. What they got wasn't complete, but it was enough. One message stood out. Between a legal assistant on the lawsuit and a former DOJ staffer who had worked under Boasberg. "JB says we'll bury it in pretrial. No panic. No files go public unless forced." 3 days later, Boasberg ruled to delay discovery. Legally, that could mean anything. Judges delay discovery all the time, but paired with the message, it looked like a chess move, a preemptive block. Bondi didn't see a cautious judge. She saw a gatekeeper, one protecting people on both sides of the aisle from having their messages, their decisions, their misconduct dragged into the open, and she knew. The longer he held that bench, the colder the trail would get. She called a late-night meeting with her legal team. "If we don't act now, the window closes. This case gets sealed forever, and the public never hears a thing." One advisor hesitated. "You think he coordinated a cover-up?" Bondi didn't hesitate. "I think he knew who would be named," she said. And I think he chose his loyalties. That phrase, chose his loyalties, would later make headlines. The Wall Street Journal, The Hill, NPR. It became a quiet rallying cry for those who saw Bondi's fight not as revenge, but as a battle to wrest control of the judicial process from the hands of its unseen gatekeepers. Because the real scandal wasn't just about Boasberg, it was about how easily it had all been hidden. How a respected judge, one with decades of service, had managed to delay, redirect, and obscure court actions tied to a case with national security implications. And for every step Bondi took, the resistance grew. One legal organization filed a formal complaint calling her investigation an attack on judicial independence. A former Yale law professor went on national television, accusing her of injecting politics into the judiciary. But the public wasn't buying it. The question was simple. If Boasberg had nothing to hide, why wasn't he cooperating? And the answer to that question wasn't just about Boasberg anymore, because the deeper Bondi dug, the more names surfaced. By the time she filed formal charges, Washington was already shaking. She stood before the press again, this time flanked by two senior DOJ investigators. No cameras were allowed inside the internal briefings, but just outside, reporters huddled by the door, recording every word that slipped through the cracks. Her voice was steady. No theatrics, no fire, just facts. We believe Judge James Boasberg has knowingly interfered with federal investigations, misused his authority to shield select individuals from scrutiny, and compromised the integrity of our justice system. The Department of Justice is pursuing formal charges. Then came the list: obstruction of justice, misuse of judicial authority, willful concealment of evidence, failure to recuse in a matter involving known conflicts of interest. Within hours, the legal world exploded. Law firms sent emergency alerts to their litigation teams. Judges met behind closed doors, discussing the fallout. Inside federal agencies, emails with Boasberg's name were quietly deleted or locked behind restricted access. But what came next made it real. Bondi's office released a set of internal messages, legally cleared for public review. None were classified, but they were damning. Messages hinting that hearings had been rescheduled to favor particular legal teams. A text that read, "Keep this one in my courtroom. Too risky for another judge." A personal email to a former colleague, suggesting legal timelines be coordinated around expected political changes. Not a smoking gun on its own, but to the public, it looked like corruption wrapped in a robe. And Boasberg? Silence. No press statement. No court appearance. No official denial. His clerk issued a single response. Judge Boasberg has always served with honor and integrity, and will respond through the appropriate legal channels. That only made it worse. People wanted answers. They wanted Boasberg to face a microphone to explain himself. Instead, his allies spoke for him. Commentators on mainstream media defended him, calling it a witch hunt, claiming Bondi was weaponizing her office, that she was sending a message to other judges who ruled against conservative interests. For every critic she gained something else: louder support, veterans, small business owners, border agents, even former court clerks who had worked under Boasberg. Some defended him, but more came forward with stories, not bombshells, whispers. A court translator in Laredo remembered seeing documents disappear from a deportation case reassigned to Boasberg at the last minute. A paralegal in Ohio claimed her team was once told to hold off on filing because a friendly judge wanted to take jurisdiction. Each story, on its own, was small, but together, they painted a picture. And Bondi? She wasn't done. She gave one last interview before stepping away from the cameras. The reporter asked if she feared the political fallout of charging a sitting federal judge. Her response was simple: "Let the consequences come. I'd rather lose my seat than lose my spine." That line hit like a hammer. Within hours, it was on coffee mugs, bumper stickers, digital ads, and the fight was just beginning. Her critics tried to mock it, but the damage was already done. The line had stuck, inside the courthouse, inside the public consciousness. Meanwhile, preparations for pre-trial hearings had begun. It would be slow. Judges rarely went on trial. Even fewer faced criminal charges. But it was happening, and the world was watching. The lines were drawn now. You were either with Bondi, believing the justice system was long overdue for a reckoning, or with Boasberg, defending the judiciary from what looked, to some, like a politically motivated takedown. But beneath the chaos of public opinion, a quieter storm was forming. Because what came next wasn't just about the courtroom. It was about trust. The trial hadn't even started, and yet the damage was already spreading. Inside a quiet courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia, Judge Boasberg finally appeared. He didn't walk through the main entrance. Marshals escorted him through a side hallway, away from the swarm of reporters outside. His suit was pressed. His expression was blank. The man who once presided over some of the nation's most sensitive legal matters now stood as a defendant, flanked by attorneys, jaw set tight. The charges were read aloud. The presiding judge remained impassive. No grandstanding, no theatrics, just facts, motions, paperwork. Boasberg pleaded not guilty. Outside, the crowd was split. Protesters, supporters, media vans lined the block. Some held signs, "No more shadow justice." Others waved flags, chanting for Bondi. You could feel the divide. But beneath it all, the same question lingered. Can we trust the people behind the bench? The judiciary had always seemed untouchable. Judges weren't politicians. They didn't campaign, didn't argue on Twitter, didn't show up on late-night talk shows. They ruled. And for the most part, people accepted that. But now it felt like the mask had slipped. Bondi stayed out of the spotlight after the arraignment. No press conferences, no follow-up interviews, just her team, moving forward, quiet, focused, confident. But she understood what had happened. She hadn't just filed charges. She had cracked open a door no one wanted to admit existed. One morning, her assistant walked in holding a padded envelope with no return address. Inside, a letter, handwritten, shaky cursive. It was from a retired federal clerk in Santa Fe. I watched Judge Boasberg override a colleague in 2017 over an immigration hold. The case was never reported, no press. The man was released. 2 months later, he killed a sheriff's deputy in Oklahoma. We all knew it happened, but no one said a word. Bondi didn't share the letter publicly. She didn't need to. The stories were surfacing on their own, one after another. Not all provable, not all clean, but consistent. Whispers of favoritism. Private lunches with federal attorneys. Phone calls that never made official records. And rulings, always the rulings, tilted just enough to raise questions, but never enough to demand attention, and still Boasberg said nothing. His legal team called the case an egregious overreach. They insisted he had done nothing wrong. They painted Bondi as a partisan soldier on a vendetta. But they couldn't explain the messages. They couldn't explain the scheduling delays. They couldn't explain why sealed court logs had quietly disappeared. Before key hearings tied to the Signalgate scandal in Washington, people started choosing sides. Some legal analysts warned that if Bondi succeeded, it would set a dangerous precedent, one where any judge could become a target of political backlash. But others argued that accountability wasn't a threat to the system. It was the foundation of it. Senators were split. Some backed her. Others called for an investigation, not into Boasberg but into her office. And still she didn't flinch, because beneath the headlines, beneath the noise, something had shifted. Ordinary Americans, people who had never cared much about judicial hearings or federal judges, were now watching C-SPAN. Reading court transcripts, following every update. This wasn't about Bondi anymore. It wasn't even about Boasberg. It was about whether power still had limits. And in coffee shops, around kitchen tables, in break rooms across the country, people were talking about justice in a way they hadn't in years. But one last piece still had to fall. into place. The reckoning. Would this be just another scandal or a turning point? The verdict came down on a late spring evening. No flashing lights, no triumphant music, just the gavel's sharp crack and the hushed rustle of people shifting in their seats. Judge Boasberg was not found guilty on all counts. Some charges were dropped, lack of hard evidence. Key messages had been erased long before the DOJ could reach them. But 2 charges stuck: willful concealment of evidence, misuse of judicial authority. The courtroom was silent as the clerk read the words. Boasberg didn't move. His lawyers lowered their heads. The sentence: permanent disbarment, loss of his bench, a federal review of his past rulings, no jail time. But no way back either. Pam Bondi didn't celebrate. No press conference. No victory lap. She simply walked into her office, looked out at the Jefferson Memorial, and whispered to herself, "That's one." Because this was never about just one man. It never had been. In the weeks that followed, something rare happened. People stopped arguing, just for a moment. Not about party lines, not about politics, but about truth. For the first time in a long time, the public saw behind the curtain, not into some grand conspiracy, not into a puppet show, just into the messy, flawed, deeply human system that runs American justice. One Boston court clerk, speaking anonymously, put it plainly. He wasn't a villain. He believed he was doing the right thing. But that's not enough. Not when you wear that robe. And that was the lesson. The one Bondi wanted people to remember. Power isn't about what you say in front of cameras. It's about what you choose. When no one is watching, Boasberg had chosen silence. Secrecy, protection. Bondi chose transparency, even when it put her on the line. Letters poured in, from families who felt overlooked by the system. Man in Wichita, his son deported despite being cleared of all charges. A woman in Bakersfield, her sister assaulted by someone released under a deferred hearing, one that passed through Boasberg's courtroom without a single public record. These weren't just stories, they were consequences, real people, and for Bondi, that was the point. In one of her few public appearances after the trial, she stood before a class of first-year law students at the University of Florida. No notes, just her voice. "Don't chase headlines," she told them. "Chase the truth. Because if you don't, someone else will write your version of it for you." The room was silent. Some scribbled notes. Others just stared wide-eyed. Her critics still called her reckless. But now, others were asking harder questions. How many other judges were making quiet choices in shadowed corners of the law? How many? Rulings were less about justice and more about protecting the machinery. The Justice Department quietly launched a new internal review system for federal judges. It didn't make front-page news, but it mattered, because now someone was watching. And that's what accountability is really about. Not fear, not revenge. Presence. Being there, watching, not looking away. Pam Bondi had left the system with a bruise. Yes, but sometimes a bruise is what reminds the body where it's weak, and as the dust settled, the story faded from the headlines. Boasberg moved out of D.C. His name slipped from the public eye, but the echo of his fall remained. In the chambers where others now sat, robes freshly pressed, verdicts still in their hands. Let this be the lesson. Even the highest bench can crack, and when it does, it's not about how hard the fall is, it's about what the rest of us learn from it.